Um, my name is Roderick Lynch, and I'm the chair of LDCRE. Good evening to you all, and I welcome you to the LDCRE Race Equality Leadership Hustings, which is independently chaired by Sunda Katwala. Sunda is the director of British Future, formerly General Secretary of the Fabian Society, and an eminent journalist from The Observer. So I'm going to hand you over to the chair tonight, and he's going to give you some of the house rules, etc. And I hope you enjoy these hustings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roderick, and thanks to the Liberal Democrat Campaign for Racial Equality for organising tonight's event and making sure that race equality is part of this leadership contest at a time when issues of race and racism are probably more central to our public debate than ever before. I'm Sunda Katwala. I'm the director of British Future, which is a think tank and a charity that engages with issues of identity, immigration, integration and race, looking for the common ground that can bring us together. We're a non-partisan group. As a charity, we're very keen to see all parties find their voice and play their part in finding common ground on challenging issues like race in Britain. So we've got a great chance to do that tonight with Layla and with Ed as they compete to be your next leader. A Liberal Democrat Party, I think we would all think would think a lot about race equality and diversity and inclusion in a liberal society. I think in some ways your party has made some very important contributions to this debate. One of your founders, your former president, Jenkins, was a very important figure in race equality in our country because he was the Home Secretary who passed the first anti-discrimination laws in 1968, and that was a pioneering move at the time. And so while he was a Labour Home Secretary, he had a liberal vision of a multicultural society and the future that Britain should have. And that was at the time when Enoch Powell, in response to that, made his infamous Rivers of Blood speech. And so that debate between liberal and reactionary views about race has been with us for a long time. That was an all-white parliament that passed that pioneering legislation. We had decades where, you know, there were 1 million Black and Asian Commonwealth migrants to Britain, had no voice in our politics, no voice in our media, very little voice in our professional life while the debate was about whether they should be sent back or allowed to have an opportunity in British society. So that's another issue for race equality. The liberal tradition, the Liberal Party was ahead of the game in the 19th century because Dadabhai Naoroji was the first British Indian MP. He was the Liberal MP for Finsbury Park. He was the first non-white MP in our country. So the Liberals made an early contribution there. I think something that's come up in the discussions ahead of this hustings by the Campaign for Race Equality, by the candidates themselves, is there's a lot to do because that 19th century progress was hard to sustain. Actually, the 19th century Liberals were stronger than the 20th century Liberal Democrats at race representation in Parliament. So it was 2004 before we had a successor to Naoroji in the 21st century, and it was actually one of our candidates tonight, Layla, in 2017, elected in Oxford West as the first British Palestinian MP who was, you know, your first modern mixed race MP. It was just last year that we had the first Black MPs in the Liberal tradition after a century and a half. And unfortunately, Chukwuemeka and Sanjima didn't retain their seats, but that was an important breakthrough. So there's been some recent progress, and Ed, you've talked about that, you know, in your local area as well and in your local party. But a central theme as Liberals and Liberal Democrats, you seek to have a leading voice in our national debate. You've got work to do close at home as well. So we've got a lot to talk about tonight in this hustings. Unfortunately, I'll be putting all of the questions that have been sent in. We won't have the kind of interaction we'd have had in normal times, but we'll do what we can to do what the Campaign for Race Equality wants to do and to make sure race is central. Let me jump straight to the first question. And this is a question from Nancy Girara, who has this question. And she tells us as well that she was in the intensive care ward for nearly 5 weeks in March. So it's great, Nancy, that you're back from that experience and here to put the first question tonight. And this is Nancy's question. Given the lack of recognition, she says, of the historical importance of slavery and its absence from the national curriculum, and that the structures of ordering society and community based on the domination and subordination of one race by another is the real root of racism. Given that that hasn't been recognised, how would you, both as the leader of a national political party that stands against injustice and inequalities and unfairness, how would you now go about influencing the direction this country will take in response to Black Lives Matter and the disproportionate deaths as well of ethnic minority Britons during the current COVID-19 pandemic? Layla, if I could put that question to you first.
Well, thank you, Cinder. Thank you, Nancy, for your question. And this is, of course, it's an enormous question. And I'll take it in the two parts that it was expressed. Firstly, I completely agree with you. If we as a country don't understand our own history, then how on earth can we fully understand and appreciate the beauty of the diversity that we have in this country, but also recognize that so much of our current wealth, of our societal structures, have been built on, at points, the oppression of one ethnic minority group by, very often, it's the white male dominated society that we've seen for so long. And tackling this, I think we as liberals have recognized as an incredibly important thing to do. But unless we are teaching our children this, and unless we are changing the way that we understand our own history, unless we are facing our own history in ourselves, which is a movement that as a teacher I used to engage with in the schools that I would teach in, then we don't stand a chance to actually tackle the underlying issues here. So in my role as education spokesperson, I have been pressing on this issue. I called for a complete review of the curriculum and have been working with civil society groups to do that. We wrote to Boris Johnson and Nick Gibb on the specific matter of challenging the bias, the white bias in our curriculum, whether that be teachings about slavery, but also celebrating ethnic minority champions in all parts of the curriculum. When was the last time at school you were actively taught about, say, a Black scientist or a Nobel Prize winner? Actually, it can be weaved into all parts of our curriculum, and it should be. And Nick Gibb wrote back actually just last week and basically dismissed it. He said that, no, we're not going to do this. We think that it already exists. He listed a few opportunities where teachers could do this, and it's not good enough. So I will continue to press. The issue actually there is to get the Tories out of the Department for Education. Nick Gibb in particular has a very backwards view of this country and of how to be teaching. And my view has always been, actually, let's celebrate each other's diversity and face our own history in ourselves. To COVID-19, well, I'll start perhaps by relaying some of the evidence that I was hearing this morning. I chair the inquiry into coronavirus for the all-party group. We're taking evidence all the way through the summer, and we have our sessions on a Wednesday. And this morning we heard from people who are suffering from long COVID, so the long-lasting effects of coronavirus, but also bereaved families. And there was a gentleman called Charlie who relayed the experience that he had had looking after his father and also of others of the Black community in particular, who had been told by NHS 111 that one of the things that they needed to do was, they were asked, are their lips blue? And that was an indicator as to whether or not they should be going to hospital or not. And he made the point, quite rightly, that when you are Black, it is much harder to see if your lips are blue. And that kind of advice that was being rolled out across NHS 111 is a tiny example of some of the things that have been going wrong in our ability to protect a group in society that we know are disproportionately likely to suffer from mortality or morbidity as a result of coronavirus. And we have to get to the bottom of this. The government, in its own review, kept much of it hidden. We need an open and transparent review. And in the inquiry that I'm leading now, then I am intending to hold specific sessions on this, because we have to get to the bottom of it and expose this injustice for what it is.
Thanks, Layla. Ed.
Well, thank you, Nancy. I hope you're better. It must have been a difficult period for you. But our hearts go out to you. I'm glad it looks like you're on the mend. In terms of the history of our country, we do have to teach all the many flaws of British history. obviously the British Empire in particular, things that happened under our rule in India, in Africa, in other parts of Asia, and of course the slave trade, were deeply shocking. And we need to make sure that people and our children, our young people, the whole society faces up to that. I don't believe we can go forward on the racial equality agenda if people don't realize the history of racism in our country and how the white population in Britain treated people from other countries, and including people who became British, in such an appalling way. So we absolutely have to teach that in our schools and colleges and universities. But for me, we need to go further than that. The Black Lives Matter protest is a huge wake-up call. And while we need to do curriculum and statues and so on, we need to go much, much further. I think there's structural racism in our society. I think it's in the criminal justice system. I think it's at work. I think it's in the education, the health system. Frankly, just look at it and you'll find it. And that's shocking. And I think there's been a degree of complacency in our party, in our country, among the sort of liberalism. I just think we haven't realized what our fellow citizens face and how horrible that is, how demeaning it is. Casual racism, indifference. It's not good enough. So we have to be serious about this. I've taken one particular issue to start with, and that's stop and search powers. I've chosen that because when I've talked to people in the Black community, it's the one thing that creates tension and hurt, and they feel is a huge injustice, often on a very regular basis. So if you take stop and search powers, normal stop and search powers, a Black person is 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police than a white person. If you take what's called suspicionless stop and search powers, section 60 powers, they're 47 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person. And when I asked this question to Boris Johnson, he dismissed it. So we as a Liberal Party have to be strong on reforming the criminal justice system to take that racism out of it. So Nancy, that's one of the first things I do. But if you look across the piece, whether it's the David Lammy report on racism in the criminal justice system, if it's the Windrush report, which effectively shows how much racism there is in the Home Office, if you look at Baroness McGregor Smith's report on workplace discrimination, if you look at the Angelioni report on deaths in police custody, there's enough reports out there, there's enough evidence, and this government hasn't done anything. It has been slow, it has been complacent, it wants to ignore it, and we as a party need to champion it. Let's, for the start, implement the recommendations from all those reviews I've talked about. That will go quite a way, but I think there's a lot more to do. And I think unless we recognize this level of racism and are the ones championing to stop it, to stamp it out, we won't deserve to get the support of Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities across our country. Let me finally talk about COVID. I've been leading the charge, the call for an inquiry, an independent inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005. Why? Because that's the only form of inquiry that can really hold this government to account, because it has the powers to force people to get documents. And one of the key issues in that has to be the impact on Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities. And not just people who've worked in the health service and the care service and by they've suffered, but people who've worked on our buses in other areas where it does appear had disproportionate impact. We need to show the impact it's had on poorer areas, lower income areas, and show how that reveals structural racism in our society. So Nancy, thank you for that question. It goes right to the heart of what our party needs to do. And I think we've not been on the front foot on this in recent years. We need to. And if I'm leader, this will be a priority.
Thank you, Ed. Got a somewhat linked question from Councillor Rabina Khan, who represents the party in Tower Hamlets. And she notes that following Theresa May's race disparity audit, Afua Hirsch wrote this in The Guardian. So many reports have said the same thing about addressing racism and unfairness in Britain, and far too little has changed. The truth is none of these reports mark the radical turning point that we need. And Rabina's question is, if the Liberal Democrats are to make radical changes to look and feel like modern Britain, to be a party of relevance, will the two candidates pledge to carry out a race disparity audit of Liberal Democrat MP staff? Should we not start within our own leadership before we lecture our local parties? And we had a lot of other questions about party culture and change in the party. Layla.
Thank you very much, Rabina, and also all credit to Rabina for the incredible work that she does around these issues. She's really a shining light in the party, and especially in getting the liberal point of view across in the media, and all credit to her. The race disparity audit question, that absolutely. But I would want to make sure that actually that wasn't just yet another review that ended up going nowhere. And when we have done reviews like this in the past, in particular the older DICE review, we have found that they weren't fully implemented. And the most difficult thing that we need to change, and this is what I'm absolutely committed to, this is what I have done in previous organizations that I was part of. When I was a teacher, I used to teach in international schools, and I was head of year for most of my career. And one of the things that I was in charge of was schools that often had 70 or 80 different nationalities in them, and making sure that there was a culture where every single child, no matter their background, and very often you had some quite interesting mixes in classes. I remember teaching a pair of best friends, one from Syria, one from Israel. I remember, however, also speaking to a boy from India who was relentlessly bullied because he had recently moved to England and people were making fun of his accent. And we had to create a culture within the school where that kind of bullying was absolutely unacceptable, and where in fact we saw that every single person deserved to be valued for their own content of their character, to coin a phrase from Martin Luther King. I mean, that is what we actually need to be aiming for, and we don't do this enough in our own party. And I think what the Black Lives Matter movement has shown us is that whilst we often talk the talk on this, I personally felt a bit ashamed of our party, that while we'd spoken about this, we had not achieved that change in culture. And just in the last few days, I've been talking to candidates who have actively told me about microaggressions that they still feel happen in the party. And when they, and this is the bit that's awful, when they then try and raise these aggressions to the complaints process or also to others more senior in the party, they don't have the training, they don't understand inherently why it's such a big deal. And the reason why this has to change is because it is a big deal. Because every time it happens, every time that you have a candidate who raises an issue and someone either doesn't get it or doesn't encourage them to do something about it, or even worse, dismisses it, you then have another incredible, talented person who just happens, by the way, to be from an ethnic minority background. But actually, these are incredibly talented people who we then lose from our ecosystem. And we have to cherish them. And that's the kind of culture that I want to create. One where we cherish every individual, and where they tell us that there is a problem, it is taken seriously. And it starts, in my view, yes, in MPs' offices and yes, at HQ, but it starts at the local party level. We are a grassroots organization, and quite right too, but we have to challenge our grassroots to accept the responsibility for this, alongside having a leader who makes it a clear priority. So I will make it a clear priority, but without ensuring that every single local party chair and the executive, and indeed every single person who is part of a selection panel, has unconscious bias training, valuing everyone training, understand what people of Black, Asian and minority communities feel are barriers and are barriers in our party, then they won't be able to overcome them. I think we should include and introduce a Rooney rule where a certain proportion of our selection process is reserved for people who are from an ethnic minority background. I think that we should have strong KPIs where on the ground local parties are held to account for their own diversity. And the question I think that they should answer is a very simple one. Are you representative of the community that you want to represent? It's a very obvious question. And so if you are in a community, if you are a local party that represents, you know, a large, let's say Hindu community, and I have one here in Oxford, Western Abingdon. I was at the food bank with them the other day, helping to deliver food. And while I was there, I recognized that actually not many of them are members, and I hounded them and have hounded them. And I'm delighted to say, having talked at this story a few times, I understand one has now joined, and that's fantastic. And I'm going to be actively nurturing them in the party. But there also needs to be money tied to this too. So let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's measure what it is that we want to change, and let's make it a priority from top to bottom in every single part of the party. And I thank LDCRE in advance for, I know, the important role that they're going to play in this, but it actually needs to be a responsibility of every single member.
Thanks, Leila. Ed.
Well, Rabina, first of all, thank you for what you do. You've been an absolute star and a champion, and you continue to campaign. So thank you for what you do. I'm very happy to commit to this idea of an audit of MP staff. However, what I don't want it to be is an excuse for lack of action. Because when I look across what the party's been doing on race equality, we've done a lot of talking. And I think now's the time for doing. We've had lots of reports on racial equality. We've had debates, we've had policy, and sometimes an excuse for not acting. So we've had the Alderdice review, which we referred to, brilliant review, published in 2018. But if you read it, it refers to a 2004 report, Diversity, Racial Equality in the Party, and a 2008 report, From Barriers to Benefits. And the 2020 General Election Review refers to Alderdice. You get my point? There's been a lot of reports. I want us to act. And let's act on staff. And although it was not my appointment, I am delighted that under my acting leadership, we've appointed to our staff, the most senior member of staff ever appointed by the Liberal Democrats from a Black and Asian minority ethnic background, a lady called Mimi Turner. She's the Director of Research, Strategy and Communications. It's a new post, and I think that already sends a very good signal. But I think we've got to do a lot more in staff, but also in candidates. And let's commit ourselves to all Black, Asian and minority ethnic shortlists. Let's campaign with others for the law to be changed so those all BEM shortlists are allowed. But let's not wait for the law to be changed. Let's do everything we can now to select a diverse team of target C candidates that ensures our party looks like modern Britain. And yes, we need a Rooney Rule for reserved positions on shortlists, because that is allowed under the law. But I want to give notice to the party that within days of becoming leader, I will contact every target parliamentary seat and every target council to ask for their plan to address racial equality in their forthcoming selections. And I want to go further. Not only do I want to see many more people selected at senior council level, at parliamentary candidate level, we've got to make sure that those candidates get full support, financial, mentoring, training. And unless we do that, Ravina, I don't think we're going to change the party. So your question is absolutely right. We've got to do far more than we've done, but please don't let us just do more reports. We've got enough evidence. We know what to do. Let's just do it. Let's just do it. And if I'm leader, this will be my #1 priority. If you read the Alderdice review, what John Alderdice says in that is there has been a lot of talking. And he says the only way we're going to do this is change the whole culture of the party. That's the message of the Alderdice review. Change the whole culture. And that means whether it's MPs, peers, council leaders, local party officials, people on shortlisting committees, whatever, they've got to know that this is the priority of the party. Yes, they've got to have the unconscious bias training, but they've got to know that they'll be judged by how they do. And if I'm leader, they'll know that I'll be looking, and not just looking, I'll be within the rules that we're allowed to act, because leaders aren't dictators. Within the rules, we'll be coming down hard to make sure that they are ensuring that our party does what it says it's going to do. Be a party of equality and diversity. We've failed for too long. We've got to get on with it.
The largest number of questions we had for this hustings were about this issue in terms of all of the Parliamentary Party always says the right things, but can we commit on the details as well? So Chris Annus, who's the membership secretary of the LDCRE, had a similar question asking about the specifics there that you've both been talking about. The law change for all BME shortlists, a Rooney rule for candidates, and committing to funding a leadership training and mentoring program so that people have that support. And his question that relates to that, he was saying he's mixed race, he's university educated, he's got experience interning in politics, but the challenge is, can he trust you to help ethnic minority men like himself transition from skilled volunteering into more impactful and professional contributions to the party, given that the staffing is so undiverse still? And the Lib Dem Black Action Group had a similar question, and they particularly wanted to mention the complaints procedure, that on the whole it will be a majority white panel of party members that assesses complaints, with little involvement of black members or external race equality advisors. How would you rectify that? And that the perception, they say, among members is that the processes are very slow and lengthy. So how could you give them more confidence with zero tolerance approach to racism and bullying and resolving complaints swiftly? So Ed, if I come back to you, just more about some of the details you were talking about is what a lot of members here want to know about.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for your question. How can you trust me? Well, I'm totally committed to this, but I've actually done stuff while I've been an MP. I mean, I'll give you one example. One person who came to volunteer for me was a guy called Ruan Kodikara. I don't know if anyone on this call knows Ruan, but he started as a volunteer, then I employed him. Then he went to become a press officer in the party. He rose up the ranks there, and then he's gone to very high jobs, well-paid jobs in PR and comms in the private sector. But he went all through the ranks in the party, through to the comms side of the party. And I supported him all the way, and he remains a good friend. So just one example, I could give you others, but you know, you can go and talk to Ruan Kodikara about how I work with him to support him. And I think that's what it's about. It's about people like me, people like Layla, MPs, senior councillors, senior party officials, making sure they make this a personal priority. Now, there's lots of warm words, aren't there? If I'm leader, I want to be held to account. I want people to say, well, what's Ed done in the first month? What's he done in the first year? You know, how's it going? Has there been any changes? Because we have talked about this for too long. And unless we can show real action and real progress, people are going to be very cynical and say we've heard it all before. And that means, by the way, not only will we not be true to our principles and values, but we won't win elections. There's enlightened self-interest in getting this right. You know, in my constituency, we've got a large Tamil population, a large Gujarati population, a large Korean population, largest in Europe. We've got a Muslim population, mainly from Pakistan and Bangladesh, but also from Syria, Iran, Iraq. There's a mosque in North Kingston that I go to and talk to the worshippers there. We've got a Sikh population from East Africa and a lot of asylum seekers from Afghanistan. And I've engaged with these different populations over 20 years. And the way I've sort of managed to develop the relationship is I've reached out to them. I've gone to their places of worship, their schools for their kids, where they socialize. And by going out to them and reaching out to them, I've got their trust. And as a result, lots of people from the different communities have joined our local party. So we have, compared to other local parties, we have a very high proportion of our membership that reflects the diversity in our local community. I'm very proud of that. 8 of our 38 councillors are from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds. So we brought people on and that's, you know, the record that I have in staff, in local members, and in local councillors. And it's that reaching out that I would like to do as leader, both to teach it to others who've not yet done that, but also to show that I, as the national party leader, would do that to the communities at all levels. The other question on the complaints procedure is extremely well made. And I make the analogy with the wider criminal justice system in our country, whether it's the courts, magistrates, police, CPS. You find racism and you find a lack of representation. What I've noticed in the Larry report on that, but also a lot of debate after and through the Black Lives Matter protests, is something I hadn't really understood before, I'll be honest with you. How I think white people don't quite understand how privileged they are. I don't think I have quite understood how daily racism is felt by people. I've lots of friends from Black and ethnic minority population I have throughout my life. One of my best friends from school is a guy called Naresh Agarwal, who lives 3 miles from me. We're still in touch. Naresh never really complains about it, but I know he experiences it. And given we know that's what people feel in society, we know the criminal justice system is wrong, why should we think that our systems and our party is any different from society? And if we ask the criminal justice system, the magistrates and others to reform themselves, we should reform our society, our party, our institution, our complaint procedures. And it's just not good enough that they aren't representative, that they don't have members from Black and ethnic minority membership. And we need to rectify that. Now, it's the party leader does not control the complaint process. Let me be clear about that. I don't think you'd want that. You don't have the Prime Minister controlling the courts, do you? However, I think I would want to give a very strong steer to the federal board, the chief executive, president of the party, that we need to sort that complaints procedure out so that people who are on those complaint panels reflect the country and our party.
Thanks. Layla, so a lot of call for more detail about how this needs to happen.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this question. And I think asking for specifics, and what I'm sensing behind your question is also a very justified skepticism that you get these leadership elections, you have a lot of laudable words, and because of the experience of the party in the past, but also the experience at the country, there are points where there are flashpoints, it hits the news, everyone suddenly has an opinion, suddenly everyone's appalled and ashamed, and then nothing changes. And so I think actually committing to very specific things is very important. But I also want to highlight the fact that my leadership is very collaborative. I think that when we are deciding what is the top priority, how are we going to tackle these things, that we do it together. I think one of the first things that is incredibly important for me to do as leader is to make sure that LDCRE are right there at the table as we consider how are we going to actively do this. Changing the culture of a party is something that could be written in one line and can take years to achieve. So what are some of the specifics that I hope that we will look at? But again, I do think that this needs to be co-created. This should not be, panels of white people deciding how to solve this problem for others. Actually, this needs to be co-created and bought into by the whole party. And I think some of the things that we did do in the past should be resurrected. I would not be here if it weren't for a program called the Leadership Program that actually started in 2012, and it was to encourage people from minority backgrounds, so whether it be women, from ethnic minority backgrounds, LGBT backgrounds, intersectionality is a thing, I tick all 3 of those boxes, and to encourage them and recognize that when often they join a political party or try and get involved in a political party, one of the things that they first notice is that they're different, because they might go to, the local member pub event and see that actually there aren't very many people in that room that look like them, that even think like them. They might have different experiences, and oh, that's so interesting. And oh, by the way, where are you really from? which I've heard at a Lib Dem event. And I don't think they even, it has to be called out at that very grassroots level. And that's why that training is so incredibly important. But also we need to give confidence to other members. It shouldn't be people who are suffering those microaggressions, and that's just an aggression, frankly, but it's an illustrative example. It shouldn't just be them that are defending themselves against it. We have to get to a point in the culture where if someone says this, they are called out immediately on the spot by someone else who isn't necessarily the person on the receiving end of that. And that's what I mean by making sure that we deliver that training to everyone in the party. And that takes resource, but we should also bring back that leadership program, because if you are someone who then got through that first meeting and you then put yourself forward to be a candidate, and we also know that disproportionately some of those candidates struggle financially to stand. We know this from our own councillor base. If you look at our councillor base, actually it's one of the areas that we need to be tackling most urgently, because very often that is the in to politics, and that is what can give a little bit of income to encourage people to continue in the party alongside their other jobs. But we only have 3% of our councillor base that is from an ethnic minority background. That's nowhere near enough. So let's reintroduce a leadership program. Let's make sure that all local parties and every single member recognizes that they have their part to play. And that's what I meant earlier by that. And to the point about the complaints process, I completely understand the frustration with this. I also want to give credit to people like Alice Thomas and Candy Piercy, who actually did an overhaul of the complaints process relatively recently. And they've been working hard to do this. But I don't think that there is enough that is done currently to resource it, and that's why it's often very slow. It's resourced in a very skeleton way by HQ. We need to make this a priority. And I actually think that if we have a situation where it's an all-white panel and you've got someone who wants to have better representation on the panel, that becomes an automatic right that they can ask for. So this is something that needs to be co-created, done with the president, with the CEO, but also with the incredible volunteers that make our party work. And we have to assume, first and foremost, that there is a will to want to make this happen. But sometimes we need to ensure that the resource and the money is there behind it. So the last thing I'll say is that we absolutely need to fundraise specifically for this. And I've got some donors in mind that I intend to go to.
Thank you. So hopefully some of the campaign have been taking notes about some of the specific commitments that you've got tonight. Let's go on to another issue, and a hot potato issue on which we've got two linked questions. Noah Murphy has a very simple question. Do you think descendants of African slaves deserve reparations to help close the racial wealth gap? And then we've got a related question. It's from a party member. They wanted to remain anonymous, but the campaign knows who they are. And this question says this: the compensation of slave owners rather than the freed slaves is a shameful historic injustice that casts a dark shadow over this country still today. Should the Lib Dems be leading the national debate on reparations and restitution? A similar question. And as the inheritors of the abolitionist liberals of the 18th and 19th century, should the Lib Dems accept donations in this century from people whose wealth was linked directly to slavery? So some linked questions there about reparations and slavery, but also about party donations. Layla.
Thank you very much, Noah and Anonymous, for these questions. And it's one that obviously we've been thinking a lot about in the last few weeks in the context of the statues that we see around all of our cities. We have one of Cecil Rhodes here in Oxford that actually I was campaigning to bring down for the last 3 years. I'm delighted we finally got somewhere with it. But also the specific point about reparations to descendants of slave families and compensation in general. It's a really difficult one. And the reason why it's incredibly difficult is because actually I want to see that kind of inequality wiped out from society in the first place, but actually it's a societal issue. These are structural issues, and I'm not sure that just money is going to solve this problem. I do think that money is a part of it, and we know that if you are coming out of university and you're Black Caribbean, after a year of working, you are earning 10% less than your white counterparts. This is exactly the kind of disparity that we see in our society all the time. We know that Black applicants for jobs have to put in more applications, and actually the Lib Dem policy of having name blind applications for jobs, I think, is absolutely the right one. Actually, we say, you know, is there something practical that we can do in our party to help solve this? I would love to see the party institute that as a matter of practice. I don't think we do at the moment. And my own view is that if we find that there are donations that are coming from places that are of that background, actually we should be working with Lib Dem CRE and others to decide, first of all, is it ethical to accept that donation in the first place, depending on where it came from. I would hope then that some of that money would then be specifically earmarked to go towards a fund that might help candidates who stand, who may not be able to stand, might help to fund specific diversity initiatives within the party. And that, I think, is the way to approach this. Because I also don't think that we should be holding the children of these slave owners of the past for the sins of their grandfathers. Actually, one of the reasons why hopefully they support the Liberal Democrats is because they recognize that this is a problem and that we are a party serious about solving this problem. But let's also ensure that that money is being used for that great liberal endeavor of tackling this problem in society once and for all. So co-creation is the key, speaking to those in the party about how we approach this and trying to find a way to actually solve the systemic endemic issues in our society once and for all.
Ed, would you support reparations?
Well, I think I agree with the way that Layla approached it. You know, I think that there's no doubt that the slave history of our country is a scar on our country, and we can't go forward unless that is talked about and known about, and also that we act on it. I think you can't look at our history without realizing that continual racial inequality is not only unjustifiable in its sense, in itself, but given the history, is doubly, triply unacceptable. And that's one of the reasons why teaching this is so important, because I think it gives you the argument and the inspiration and the justification to say we have got to tackle racial inequality as a matter of urgency and at depth. And that is a equality agenda. It's a social justice agenda. I've been talking about a fairer society. You can't have a fairer society unless you deal with that racial inequality and that racial wealth gap. So I think it pushes you not to reparations, but to an even more determined position on dealing with the pay gap, making sure that companies have to report on their pay, not just between different men and women, but between different people of different racial backgrounds. I think we need to ensure that the workplace, the discrimination that we see there that was ongoing in the report I talked about earlier, that is dealt with. These practical issues that have embedded themselves in our society and that haven't been shifted. Despite some progress with legislation we saw, particularly in the 70s, that they're not being dealt with. So, for example, one thing I did with when I was a minister was try to push diversity on boards. And we managed to get diversity on boards on gender addressed, and it's made, frankly, bigger progress than I had expected when I commissioned the report. But we should do exactly the same for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities. You know, the FTSE 250, the FTSE 350. You know, why don't they represent our country? And there's no doubt that diversity in all its forms is good for business. And so there's all these different things that we have to approach if we're going to be anywhere near serious about tackling these inequalities. The specific issue on donors, again, I agree with Layla on that one too. We want to make sure that if that money is available from those sources, from the grandsons and great grandchildren of those slave owners, that it goes to put right those problems that were caused. And so you could have a donors club, if you like, where some of that money went in. It was specifically earmarked to help fund some of these leadership programs for candidates from different diverse communities, that we ensure that it sort of creates a catalyst for raising more money, so we can really attack this problem in our party. So that's the way I would approach it, in a sort of positive, future looking way, with a vision that we can make our party racially equal.
So it sounds like we're going to have fundraising drives targeting specifically, actually, the descendants of slave owners, so as to support racial justice. That appeared to be the consensus between the candidates. Here's a different question about education, and it comes from Matthew Shabas. And he has this question: how do we make schools in less diverse neighbourhoods more diverse without taking away parental choice or separating schools from their communities? Ed, what do Liberals think about schools and the diverse makeup, or the mix, or the non-diverse makeup of schools?
It's a very interesting question, because in my constituency, we've got very diverse communities and diverse schools. So it's not a question that I've actually had to face in my local schools. And I've been really quite impressed about how there's no racial segregation anywhere in my constituency. Now, I absolutely accept that that will be the case in some communities, and it will be difficult. There's a challenge though, because we do believe in the party about community schools. My favourite admissions policy to a school is that it's how close you are to that school, rather than all the other complicated and I think slightly potentially unfair admissions policies that are allowed in some schools. But there is a question, Sundar, about how those admissions policies are written when it's about distance. And sometimes you do see in some schools catchment areas, particularly in secondaries actually, catchment areas that they draw and they consult on, and feeder school rules and so on. And I worry that sometimes those sorts of little nuances that you get in admissions policies can be linked not necessarily on a racial grounds, but on keeping out people and pupils from certain areas, shall we say, which might well be disproportionately Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, but might also be poorer kids. So I'm always a little bit skeptical about how some schools use the national code for admissions and play different tunes on that. And I would want us to review that national code so that schools couldn't use catchment areas or feeder school solutions to prevent it being a real community school, and therefore as diverse as the local community near it.
Layla.
Thank you. So this is an area very close to my heart. It's what I've been working a lot on more recently. I always think I'm hitting a nerve when Toby Young starts to write articles about how wrong I am. That's usually a sign that I'm on the right track, which happened with some of this stuff more recently. And I think some of the more disturbing statistics that I uncovered through Freedom of Information requests was actually the number of Black students in particular who are excluded from schools compared to their white counterparts. You're in fact 7 times more likely as a Black child to be excluded in Doncaster than you are if you're a white child in Rutland. And this made the news. It was on the Today programme, it was running on the BBC all day, and it starts to uncover what are some of the issues that students face in schools. It's also linked to the number of teachers that are not diverse, and actually encouraging people into the profession from a more diverse background is really important. And to the specific point about how do we make schools more diverse, frankly, this is why I'm in politics, because tackling educational inequality, I was a teacher for 10 years. I traveled the world. I lived in places like Ethiopia, Jamaica, Jordan, Greece. I then moved to this country. I'd done a physics degree and then fell into maths and physics teaching, mainly in international schools. And it was by doing a master's in the subject that I recognized finally, and my eyes were wide open about the extent of inequality in this country and how closely linked it is to the background of your parents, and how it's not about the innate ability of that child, the potential of that individual. And I then joined the Liberals because we are the best party in terms of our own policy at dealing with such things. And so one of the things that we looked at was this idea of how do you encourage real choice, real parental choice? Because at the moment, yes, there are issues with catchments. This has been supercharged, by the way, under the academization and the free schools policy that was brought in fact, under Labour, but then supercharged by the Conservatives, who thought that this marketization of schools was the way to drive up standards. But actually what happened was that you then had primarily boards of middle-class white parents who were setting up schools and then trying to finesse catchments so that they would catch the primary school that those secondaries were being formed in. And so you ended up in a situation where, actually, to be perfectly honest, I don't think it was overt. I think it was more they were playing the system for their own family and friends gain. And it ended up exacerbating those inequalities. There are some parts of the country that have introduced actually more of a lottery system to schools locally to ensure that you then have no way of gaming that system. There's also an issue of, if you are able to buy a house in close to the good school, then that drives up house prices, and disproportionately, especially if we know that there are certain communities that can't afford to buy those houses, that then makes those schools ones that are inaccessible. And the way we solve this actually is very, very difficult, but it's predicated on the concept that every local school should be an amazing school. Every local school should have the resources that they need to bring out the best in every child. I've worked over the last few years on our policy that is now very research, very evidence-based, and making sure that we have very specific things that we can do. So, for example, ensuring that schools, when they are measured not just as an individual school, but actually are measured on a wider basis, so that you actually end up with a positive relationship between schools and how they improve. And what that means is that a school that is in that, more expensive part of the borough, that then has parents who can afford to have tutors and also have fewer behavioural issues, is measured alongside the school that might be in the slightly poorer part and has disproportionate numbers of students on pupil premiums, who also are coming from families that are unsupported right now because of local government cuts, and that they are actively asked to help each other. And you create a dynamic where schools don't compete, but they actually help one another. And that's how you can spread diversity. And it's what I've done as a school governor here locally. I'm a school governor to a primary school that's wonderfully diverse. And we've built those partnerships with those other schools, and it's working really well. So thank you for your question. It's a very complex one, but one that I think we're already beginning to make some progress on what is the right policy to tackle as a party.
Thanks, Leila. I think the next one, I think I've got the most Liberal Democrat question of the night, and I say that because I think 5 or 6 people asked it. Peter Hurst, Catherine Santos, Richard Lowry were among the people to ask it, and you might have already guessed what it is. How important do each of the leadership candidates consider achieving proportional representation at Westminster and local elections is to achieving racial harmony in the UK? Is achieving racial harmony in the UK perhaps the missing ingredient in the campaign for electoral reform? Leila, I might go to you first with that.
Thank you, Sunda. Actually, when you said that, I was imagining that we might have a question about potholes or socks and sandals. So, PR is also well up there as top Lib Dem things that we care about. Proportional representation is why partly I joined this party. It's predicated on the idea that every vote in this country should matter. And what we know, of course, is that if you live in a constituency that hasn't changed hands, you could put a blue rosette on a donkey, and then you end up with that donkey winning. That is not right. Actually, you should be able to be anywhere in the country and know that your vote will count equally. But also, the current first past the post system doesn't deliver the parliament that people voted for. And we saw this at the last election. We had a Conservative Party that now has an 80-seat majority. You'd have thought they won that election by a landslide, and yet we know they didn't. And in fact, parties who are more on the centre and the centre left were the ones that actually won out at the time. So we've got to really tackle this. And I think the link that you make with racial harmony, but actually I would argue not just racial harmony, just harmony and happiness in our communities, where every single person feels that they are equally valued and have equal power and equal agency. I mean, surely that is what lies at the heart of liberalism. And there are some changes that the Conservatives are bringing in particular, having ID to vote, that we know is going to disproportionately affect ethnic minority communities. And that is one of the reasons why we have so vociferously tried to stop that from happening. But yet, you know, because they have an 80-seat majority, they are insistent that this is going to go ahead. We also continue to advocate for votes at 16 and 17. And we have seen from where it has been introduced in Scotland and a more proportional system there, it's now introduced in Wales, that actually young people, engaging them early in the democratic process, actually is an incredibly valuable way of making them also feel that they are bought into the bigger societal changes. And you know, on this issue, on the issue of race equality, young people are far better at understanding the underlying issues. They are far better at advocating for this. And whenever they do, and whenever I do, you get called woke because you care. And I was asked this actually at a radio hustings the other day. They were saying, people say that you're woke. What do you say to that? And I said, you know what, if woke means that I wake up in the morning and I fight inequality, and then I fight for people who are being oppressed in our country, and I fight for every person to be valued for the individual that they are, then you can call me woke, and I'm proud of it. And actually, if this party becomes a party, not of woke people necessarily, but of a party that then gets known for fighting for those issues, I think that that will explain to people one of the key things that was recognized in the Thornhill Review. You know, when people ask themselves, what are the Lib Dems for? What do you stand for? Well, I very much hope that we can reclaim that space as being the party that stands up for every single person in the country, no matter their background, no matter the colour of their skin, sexuality, or anything else.
Can we call you woke and proud, Ed?
Yes, of course. But you can also call me a PR fanatic, going back to the actual question. Because Peter Hurst and other people asked this question, we're asking about PR. And are we in favour of it? And do we believe it will help racial harmony? And the answer is yes and yes. I've campaigned on PR for 30, 40 years, no, 35 years, for many reasons. Fair votes and make votes count is what it's all about. And I think a number of minority in our country have been excluded from power, have not had voices because of our electoral system. So the question is, can we get it? And then what's the best electoral system to help minority communities, whether they're in Leicester or Birmingham or Manchester or Bradford, anywhere in the country? We need to make sure that people's voices can be heard. The good news is, I think, the chances of PR are much greater than people have realised, for this reason. First of all, we had a referendum on the alternative vote system, which was not proportional, and that's been rejected. That was Labour's always their excuse for not doing PR. So that's sort of gone. Then Labour Party is in a lot weaker position than they have been in recent times. They've lost all the seats in Scotland, they've lost a lot of the seats in the Northern Red Wool. And I think Starmer's a clever guy. He's going to realise that they're not going to be able to get a majority by themselves. Moreover, that they'd be lucky to form a minority administration or a coalition as the major party, and therefore electoral reform is now in the Labour Party's interests. And this is something we've got to work at, my friends, whether it's electoral reform nationally or locally. We have got to take this opportunity, and I have this sort of dream that maybe after the next election, if we've got 40, 50 seats, and the Labour Party's got to sort of 280, 290, there could be an arrangement. I don't quite know what it was, I'm not predict it, but something that gets PR in. So that's not that far away. So this is something to really fight for, to really go for, because it wouldn't just make our electoral system fair, it would unlock progressive politics, including the chance to make real progress, sustained progress on racial equality in Britain. But there's a question that follows from can you get it? Because can you get it is what it's all about. It's getting to power and doing stuff. Then is what sort of PR? Now, I'm completely committed to a single transferable vote of PR because I think that's better for the voter. It gives them more power. I actually also think it's better for racial harmony, because if you've got a multi-member constituency that none of the constituencies previously were voting for a candidate from a Black, Asian, ethnic minority group, and the particular minority in that area didn't get a voice, then under SDV, under multi-member, you're much more likely to get a candidate that represents the community, that minority in that community that's still significant. So I think SDV PR has many attractions. Some people think a list system like we had in the European elections, where the party effectively selects the list and the voters have to lump it, is a better model, because the party might promote people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds. And that's possible. And I don't like that system because it gives too much power to the party, but potentially it could work. And I think we should have that debate. LDCRE should have that debate. I'll be arguing for STV PR. But the key thing for your question, Peter and others, is PR the right way forward? It absolutely is. And it could really unlock not just a more representative system where people from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds have a greater voice. I think it could be unlock the progressive politics, which has held back this agenda in our country for too long.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to risk saying something slightly heretical as I link on to the next question. There will be a link. I think you're very committed to proportional representation, electoral reform as a party because of all of the things it does for political culture, and that's a strong argument. I'm not myself convinced there's great evidence on ethnic diversity. I think it's weaker than there is on gender. If we look at continental political systems with PR, without PR, there are other things going on, I think, in cultures about diversity. If we look at our devolved assemblies that are PR based, they're very undiverse. Of course, Scotland and Wales are less diverse countries. So I think people shouldn't think it's a magic bullet. But of course, you have an idea of a broader cultural change that comes with that that would help. But to flip the question, what strikes me about the campaign for electoral reform in this country, outside your party as well, and the campaigns for remaining in the European Union as well, they're very undiverse, even though they're very liberal and they're very cosmopolitan. It's also a challenge for the environmental movement. So it is a big challenge, I think, for Liberal Democrats who believe in spreading power if diverse communities who would gain from that haven't got that argument yet. So I think you'd have a stronger campaign for PR if you had a more diverse campaign as well. And that does link to a question, Ed. I'll let you come in when I've given you a question that is about the same thing. From Kishan Devani, he says, as leader, what importance would you give to reaching out to grassroots ethnic minority communities? He wants to know if you would visit temples, mosques, churches, synagogues, places of worship. I'm sure you will do all of this, community centres. But he's saying, can you make the Liberal Democrats a force within communities that currently don't see you as an alternative to the Conservatives or Labour? And Janice Turner had a similar question about, Labour's strength in the cities and in diverse areas with diverse populations. How do local parties start to tackle that? So I think they're linked to my observation there about how some of your causes probably need more diversity. Ed, you wanted to come back on that.
Yeah, well, let me answer Kishan and Janice's questions first of all. My view is that reaching out to different communities is a very big part of the solution for our party, so we become more racially diverse and the campaign for race equality wins in our party. It comes from my experience in my own constituency. I mentioned this earlier. Large Tamil, Gujarati, Muslim, Korean population, Somali, Chinese. We're very diverse actually in Kingston. You'd be surprised. Well, I hope you wouldn't. And we have a Hindu temple in Stoneleigh just across the border. We have well, several mosques actually. We have a Gurdwara that the Sikh community have, and I helped actually find that and get that going. So we have temples and places of worship for different communities, and I absolutely believe you need to go there and be part of their culture, their community. The Korean population are mainly Christian, so with the Korean population, you tend to either go to their restaurants or to their churches. And one of the areas that we have failed as a party, and I've been saying this several times now in this campaign, I don't actually have a very large Afro-Caribbean population in my constituency. You get other parts of London where our parties are not very diverse in their membership, where there's large local black communities where Labour's been very strong. We aren't reaching out to them. And I've made the point that I've seen evidence suggest that about 50% of the black community attends church, not necessarily regularly, but every so often. Pentecostal, evangelical, black churches. And you know what? I think there's a bit of antipathy in our party about doing that, but we've got to do it. If we are serious about representing modern Britain and going out to these communities, we have to reach out. We can't sit here waiting for people to come to us. No, that's not what David Cameron did. I don't like quoting Tories, but David Cameron went out. And that's what we have got to do. So you're out to temples, but you know, where different communities organize. So the Sri Lankan community in my area, they organize around the Institute of Tamil Culture. It organizes around the Ceylon Cricket Club. It organizes around the Saturday Tamil School. So that's where I go, right? And I'm known as their Tamil MP. And that's how you do it. You build up trust. And then, by the way, in conversations, you find out what their real issues are and what their concerns are. And then you represent individuals, represent individual families, you represent the community. And that trust builds up into a really strong relationship. And from that strong relationship, you get members, you get councillors, you get people coming into the party. You get people who, they had an issue to start with, and this goes to your point, Sundar. They had an issue to start with, which wasn't to do with core liberal democrat ideas on PR or Europe or the environment, but they actually then understand what you're about, because they see you as a sort of activist party that cares for the people in the community, that's going to deal with a housing issue, the problem back in the country that they look to. So a lot of my Tamil friends in Kingston, British Tamil community, they feel they are diaspora to the Tamil community in Sri Lanka, and what happened in Sri Lanka to the Tamil community is very, very dear to their hearts. And I've done a lot of work on that, on the all-party parliamentary group. I've gone to Brussels, I've gone to Geneva, and taken up their issues, and then they respond. The Arab community and the Asian community have liked some of the work I've done for individuals in that community. So one of my constituents many years ago was illegally rendered to Afghanistan from a business trip in Africa and then taken to Guantanamo Bay. He was in Guantanamo Bay for 4.5 years. I campaigned for 5 years actually to get him released, and we did. I had to go to the Pentagon to do it. I had to go to the State Department. And because I showed commitment for human rights for that community, someone from that community, they responded. And I think that's how you win people over. You show the level of your commitment to individuals, to communities year in, year out. You show that you're not just going to talk about it. Lots of people talk. Lots of people do a lot of talking. It's action that matters. And when they see you acting, then you get their trust. Then you get their trust. And then lots of things flow from that.
Thanks, Ed. Layla, is this a question about reaching out to communities and also why sometimes hard work hasn't come off yet or worked for the party?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think a good place to start, frankly, Sundar and Kishan and Janice, would be to actually knock on doors that we might not have knocked on before. Far too often, you might go canvassing and you've got your data and you pass a council estate and you say, oh no, we're not going to go there because they never vote for us. And it happens to be a council estate where there might be an ethnic community there. And that is just not acceptable anymore. And I think we need to make sure that every single local party, but especially in places of high diversity, such as in London, that becomes something that is done regularly as part of canvas returns. And I'm a great fan of races to the top, of a little bit of healthy competition between parties. And actually, I would love to know how many are knocking on doors that they haven't knocked on in the last 10 years, for example, because the way that we tend to campaign is we gather data from a certain area. We know that that's where the Lib Dems are. And as we know from our own membership, that is disproportionately white, male, and well-educated and middle class. And so we go to where the Lib Dems are, and we go and ask them over and over again for their opinions. And then you don't end up having the time to go and knock on the doors of other people. And this applies equally to Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, as it also does to socioeconomic background. And I know we're not talking about that specifically in this, but I think it's equally important, because actually in some parts of the country, those two things are very linked. But when you talk to them, you're not doing it because of the color of their skin. You're doing it because you are all part of the same community. You believe in the same things. And actually, getting back to those broad messages, those bread and butter issues that people really care about, is, I think, the key to some of this. And that's why I have put education or top of the agenda of my campaign. The 3 E's that I talk about are education, the environment, and the economy. And education, that opportunity for the next generation to do better than you did, that sense of opportunity. My own family, my Palestinian side of the family, because we were diaspora, actually any money that they had didn't go into houses, it went into education for us. And I wouldn't be here without them doing that. And then my mother going to university, the first in the family to do that at a master's level. And that's where she met my father. And actually it was education that was driving them. And it's very often education or other issues that they really care about that are more than skin deep that we should be talking to them about. So let's encourage local parties to do this bottom up. Let's implement some of those recommendations in the Thornhill Review that talk about how we are going to change the way that we campaign. And finally, let's get away from this idea, and this was mentioned in the Alderdice Review, that in order to stand somewhere, whether as a councillor or a parliamentary candidate, that you can only do it if you're a local candidate. In my experience, local is as local does. If you care about a community and you show them that you understand their issues and that you will get things done for them, and you will demonstrate that you will go the extra mile, as our Lib Dem candidates do up and down the country, then they will vote for you. And if you don't believe it, and actually a lot of memberships, and I've heard this from several candidates over the years, people say, oh, X place is not ready for a Black MP. They wouldn't possibly vote for them. It's almost this obsession with winning that then stops members from wanting more diversity because somehow the two are negatively linked. I'm sorry, but just look at the Conservative Party. Some of their MPs who are from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds are representing some of the most white areas of the country. And the reason why it works is because for those communities, they believe that those MPs are going to deliver for them and they win. And that's the position that we need to get to as a party. Close off this idea that if you were born in an area, you can't possibly represent it. Let's turn that on its head and recognize that the way that the Lib Dems campaign, the way we get under the skin of a community and our natural instinct to do that will deliver success. And that being a candidate from a diverse background is actually a help, not a hindrance to electoral success.
Thanks, Layla. I think that is a good way to put the challenge to your own party. If Conservative associations in the home counties, if Conservative associations in Richmond, Yorkshire, which the Chancellor of the Exchequer represents, can do that, can Liberal Democrat associations in Yorkshire and in the southwest of England, not just in East London and the Midlands, do it too. So here's another question for you both, and it's from Roderick Lynch, our chair and host this evening. So I clearly had to ask his question. He's gone slightly off piste with this question, and he's got a bit of nostalgia for a lost world of a year ago or so that you might remember. The Theresa May government, he says, held indicative votes on Brexit, and a customs union failed by 3 votes. And could Liberal Democrat votes have flipped that? And would the risk of a no-deal Brexit be dangerous for these issues as well of race equality? And his question is whether you made the wrong judgment call in your choices of abstaining, I think, Layla, and voting against that Ed. Ed, let me give that to you. Was there a turning point there for the Liberal Democrats, and does that still make a difference now on Brexit?
Sundar and Roderick, thank you for the question, but you're taking me back to a nightmare period where there were many votes, and I'm not sure if one was particularly the crucial one. And I'm sure Layla will agree, you know, it was an intensity in parliamentary politics that I'd never seen before. I've served in 7 parliaments, and there was no majority, of course, and it was really close. And Roderick's right in the sense that if Liberal Democrats had voted different ways, the vote would have gone a different way. But it was an indicative vote, Roderick. It's no sure that we'd have ended up with a customs union, and might have done. But the reality was, for me, the reason I voted against that compromise was it was against party policy. It wasn't party policy. Party policy was to stay in the European Union, in the customs union, in the single market. That's what I voted for. It's what I feel passionate about. And it seemed to me that it would have been a very bad political coup if we had sort of given up because of the pressure we were getting from the media, the right-wing media, and so on. So sometimes there are difficult choices made, Roderick, and sometimes you can look back on votes and you say, well, maybe if that had changed, but you have to see in the whole context. And for our party, just imagine this. If it had been Liberal Democrat votes that had meant that we were going to leave the European Union, because at that stage, it wasn't clear we were going to. It would have been that we'd thrown in the towel. The issue we'd made so big, you know, excuse my language, bollocks to Brexit, stop Brexit. We've been the champions of it. And we'd then thrown in the towel. You know, I'd have think people would never have trusted us ever again. Now, some people don't trust us because of Brexit, because they were Leave voters and we felt that the revoke position was bad. But if just imagine what Remain voters would have thought. Lots of them are core votes. So I don't think you can blame the Liberal Democrats for if there is no deal Brexit. The blame lies fair and square with the Tories, with Boris Johnson and the Brexiteers. They've driven it. We were right to stand up to our principles as the pro-European party. I don't have any regrets of that whatsoever. And what the challenge now is how we try and stop a no-deal Brexit, but more importantly, change public opinion. Because we do need to show that cooperation with other countries is in everyone's interests. We do need to show that people who are going to suffer the most, they suffer the most from COVID, they'll suffer the most from Brexit, are the less well off. And guess what? In the less well off in our country, Black, Asian, and ethnic minority communities are disproportionately represented. So recessions, COVID, Brexit recessions, they're bad news for Black, Asian, and ethnic minority communities. So let us make that clear when we're campaigning. But let's not go down a rabbit hole of what may or may not have been. I think if we had voted a different way, it would have been bad for the party.
Layla, any regrets?
Not on this one. So first of all, in terms of the question, who is responsible for Brexit? It is the Leave campaign, it is Boris Johnson, it is those people who are in government. Now, they still have the option if they wanted to, especially with what's going on with coronavirus. So 1 in 300-year economic event, to change tack, to say, you know, we were elected on a get Brexit done mandate, but we now believe that staying in the customs union is the right thing, and that would maintain animal welfare standards, it would maintain environmental standards. And actually, I reckon Boris Johnson could probably sell it to a lot of the Leave vote, that was the right thing. And that was, in fact, him in some way delivering on what he'd said, because he does do that very well. But to the indicative votes process, I mean, I remember this, and Ed's right, we agonized and I lost sleep. This was a time where, and I remember talking about this publicly, I was suffering from very major anxiety because I felt the weight of the country's future on my shoulders. And I felt very keenly that actually, first and foremost, even above party interests, I needed to think about the country. And what I wanted to do in those votes, in the way that I voted, was to not make the best be the enemy of the good, and to find a way of expressing how I really felt, and how I think actually a lot of people felt, which is that whilst, of course, a no-deal Brexit, a bad Brexit, is not in our country's interests, and for that I voted against. And of course, the thing that I wanted the most was to have a people's vote, or indeed to revoke, which was one of the options. I think the SNP put that across. That was a positive vote. And in Parliament, you have the option of abstaining. And sometimes it's because you're paired, but in this case, I positively abstained insofar as I'm a scientist in my background. I'm a maths and physics teacher in my training before I was an MP, and I saw it this way. +1 went to the things that I really wanted. -1 went to the things that I absolutely did not want. And 0, the middle ground, was for things like the customs union. So that is why I abstained on it, because I felt that there was a place, given that these were indicative, this wasn't the end of the process, this was a potential way through, that should, if the others fall, remain on the table. And where are we now? Well, we could have still fought for what came next. And people still blame us for calling or helping to call that election that ended up so badly. But I will not stop ever knowing that we did the right thing in trying to stop Brexit, because that was the right thing for this country. And just look at the mess that it has created. Look at the effect it's going to have on our communities. And look at how it has diminished our ability as a country on the world stage to spread peace, to spread trade and aid and democracy. And it has diminished our country. So we took the right stance on Brexit. But when it came to those indicative votes, I hope I've explained to you the very complex and difficult thought process that I personally went through.
Thanks, Leila. I'd like to come back and just give you, as we approach the end, one final chance to just comment on the range of issues we've been discussing tonight, and then we'll hear from Roderick about the event, probably rather than about the customs union, to wrap up. And my reflection on the discussion we've had is we've heard a lot of agreement tonight. We've definitely heard in the questions, we haven't heard the voices of the members as we normally would, but we've also heard some frustration and some skepticism about having heard it before. But there's a consensus between you as candidates, and there's a consensus between you and candidates and your membership, that it is time to turn from talk to action, and that if you want to be credible on these national questions of race, you've got some important work to do quickly, close to home in the party as well. So it's important to hear that. Just in terms of just whatever you want to say at the end to the membership here, I'd just like to suggest that building a consensus outside of the party might be harder than it is inside the party. You know, Ed, you were talking about white privilege and white people not understanding how privileged they are. But as a language, a lot of people would say white privilege goes down quite badly with white people who don't feel at all privileged because of social class and other issues. So there's some work there to get this message that the party believes in to all of the voters that you need. But also it's good that you've agreed on a lot tonight, but I was wondering what difference would it therefore make to race equality in this party if either of you was the leader, given that there's actually quite a strong consensus between you? Maybe if I'll start with Ed for your final thoughts tonight, Ed.
Well, Sundar, thank you for chairing tonight, and thanks everybody for your questions. You know, my objective tonight was to show you that I have a vision, including on racial equality, and I've got experience from my constituency and from 20 years in politics in Parliament and 30 years in the party, and bring that experience both to lead the Liberal Democrats and the experience and commitment to make our party racially equal. There's no doubt there are huge challenges across our country inside the Liberal Democrats. I think Black Lives Matter showed that on the racial equality issue. And I'm clear that we're in a situation in our society and our economy with COVID and the recession that the challenges are hitting Britain's Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities the hardest. And so I do believe that if we reach out, a vision of a greener, fairer, more caring society will resonate actually with votes from all Britain's diverse communities. A greener economy means more jobs. A fairer society means better housing. It means equality and diversity will be priorities. And a more caring country is about us, frankly, being the voice of carers, whether it's caring staff in care homes or unpaid carers. The Black and Asian ethnic minority communities are disproportionately in those groups. So I want to challenge our party to act at all levels of the party, from party staff to councillors, from parliamentary candidates to council leaders. And getting race equality right in our party will be a central purpose of my leadership. And I want to work with the many people who have been helping me within my campaign. People like Councillor Hina Bakari from Merton, Councillor Shafak Mohammed, former MEP for Yorkshire, Munira Wilson, who's giving me great support as the new MP for Twickenham, Baroness Meryl Etche, who's, you'll all know, she's the president of LDCRE. I've got a lot of friends who are helping me in my campaign from Chinese Liberal Democrats, people like Merlene Emerson, Linda Chung, Sarah Chung Johnson, Baroness Fleur Benjamin. She's been an inspiration to millions and been a bit of a confidant to me. Adi Adiemo, our leader on Solihull Council, and others. And they've inspired me in my campaign, been very supportive of me, helped me understand the issues. And what I'm clear on is, whoever's the leader, no single person can make our party truly diverse. No single person can lead our party in the campaign on race equality. You've got to build a team to do that. So it's the leader, all of us. And my message tonight from the start has been, friends, this is actually an urgent issue. We have failed continually on this issue. The other parties look increasingly like modern Britain, and we don't. And we don't need another review and a report. We've had enough of them. Let's stop the talking and debating. Let's get on with it. Let's act. And that's what I'll do as leader. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Layla.
Well, first of all, thank you, LDCRE, for hosting these hustings, and thank you, Sunda, for so ably chairing. I've really enjoyed this discussion, and it's been incredibly thought-provoking and challenging, as it should be. Because in my view, this is one of the most important discussions of this entire leadership contest, and frankly, of my career as a public servant. And to your specific question, does it matter who wins? Well, I think it does for a range of issues, but actually on this matter, I hope people can see that the party as a whole has recognized how important this is, and that what we need to do is to be part of a movement for racial equality in our party, but also across the country, not a moment, as some might have said more recently. Things must change. Now, I mentioned earlier, I was a teacher before I was an MP. And that was outside of Westminster for over 10 years. And when I became politicized, it was because I saw that I had to do something to change the deep inequalities that I saw in our schools and among our young people. And I became an MP because I wanted to change that inequality that I saw in my own community. And I want to be your leader because I want to change the inequality I see in our country. But let's make no mistake, unless we change, unless we find a way of challenging racism, both in our party and without, and become that actively anti-racist party that frankly lies at the core of our liberalism, that is the way to reform our society. But our party's in a difficult place. I mean, we're languishing at 6% in the polls, and we have a disastrous government who is attempting to take apart our country piece by piece with policies that continue to frankly fuel racism. And there is a place for our party now to stand up to Boris Johnson, to carve out that distinct identity now more than ever. And we need a strategy, a message, and a leader that people can trust and who can credibly communicate that progressive vision that appeals to a broad base of moderate voters in all communities. And it's what I did in my constituency, overturning a 10,000 Conservative majority. And it's what we've done locally, and we now run the Vale of Whitehorse District Council. For far too long, as a party, we have been explaining the past rather than campaigning to change the future. And what we need is a renewed vision, a step change in how we operate, and a leader who can rebuild trust and get cut through. And I'm convinced that if we can do that, then we can reinvigorate our party and hold this government to account and change the future of our country. So please consider voting for me so that we can move forward together. Thank you again.
Thank you, Leila. I'm going to hand over to Roderick. Thank you for the opportunity to host the hustings tonight, Roderick. And obviously, Liberal Democrats Campaign for Racial Equality have put this on the agenda tonight. Over to you for the final thoughts of the evening. You're muted, Roderick. You need to come off mute.
Thank you very much, Sunder. And the debate has been aptly chaired by yourself, and we welcome that. LDCRE is a broad church, and when we looked at the leadership candidates, we decided that we had to have a hustings, and we reached out to somebody we class as independent, professional to do the job. And Sunder, I thank you for that. Tonight, you've heard the statements of both candidates. You've heard that liberalism is at the heart of racism and race inequality within our party. They both want to do the best for our party, but the journey has been glacially slow, as put by Glanville Williams in his email and letter to Lib Dem Voice. That is true. Race equality and race inequality is not an agenda for the swift. It's for those that can endure it. And endure it we have in this party. It's time that the general election review and the order life review and half of the trees that have been cut down to produce previous reviews are listened to. I sat on the general election review and I made sure, and I put our case for integration, I put our case for race equality to be improved in this party. And I can say this to you tonight, doesn't matter who wins, both candidates have committed to changing the agenda. Let's hope that within the first 100 days of whoever wins, that we are going to see some stark changes. And I'd like to go out and thank the Black Liberal group led by Juliet Macapilla and Nancy and Councillor Hawkins, who submitted quite a few questions tonight, and my team at LDCRE, who makes it all possible. Janice Turner, Rabina Khan, Mosin Khan, etc., Michael Bukola. Thank you very much for all the work that you do. And let us hope that we've only got a few weeks left to go, that the best person wins. But I can tell you one thing, it's going to be hard to decide the winner. Thank you very much. And Sundar, over to you with the last words. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, everybody. Good luck to you all with the rest of this campaign, and we look forward to engaging with you all in the party, the new leader, the team around them, and the party members to take forward these important changes after this contest. So good night, everybody. Thanks very much, Leila. Thanks, everybody. Ed, let's hope next time we have these debates, we can all meet in person, but I think we've managed to have a good debate with the technology. Thanks very much and good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you very much, everybody.
Good night.
Appreciate it. Bye, everyone. Stay safe.